So I'm John Kane, and I welcome you to Let's Talk Native on this Tuesday, July 2nd. While this program may not provide a path to spiritual enlightenment, we do encourage and in some cases start conversations. We don't do prayers or buffalo speeches. We take a tough look at history, oppression, and survival. We talk about culture, the arts, politics, and identity. And we may step on a few toes along the way, but our real goal here is to bring people together by breaking down what separates us. We will take on the false narratives and provide critical thinking to all that is heaped upon us, and we do it all right here from the Cattaraugus territory of the Seneca Nation. So let's talk Native. But first, let me remind people that we do stream this show on our website, which is letstalknative.com. That's www.letstalknative.com. We stream video of the show on Facebook Live. We take the audio and we put it up on SoundCloud, and it goes into podcasts that can be found on your favorite podcast platform. We take the video and we put it on our YouTube channel, which is Let's Talk Native TV. So we encourage you to, if you don't catch us live, catch us after the fact, and don't be afraid to share the show. These are conversations that need to be had. So I am the host of Let's Talk Native, and I'm assisted in studio by Jake Proud, who is managing our video and our sound, and I am joined by Ed Schindler today. And look, I've got a really specific issue that I want to talk about, and then something a little bit more general. But let me get right to it. I asked the question: who's fighting for native to native trade at this point? Who's fighting for our commerce that involves us working from territory to territory? I mean, who's doing that? Well, I'll tell you, the only person that I see doing it is Eric White. Now, look, as a matter of full disclosure, Eric White is one of my sponsors. But even before he was a sponsor, I mean, Eric is one of those guys that, look, I realize that some people, can love him or hate him, but one of the things that he's a tobacco wholesaler, first off. So he deals in native products. Some of them, are the ones you're familiar with, like Senecas and Signals, and but he also has a couple of other native brands that he brings in from other native territories, and he distributes within Seneca Nation territory, and he distributes to other native territories. So why, when he has to battle New York State, is nobody else stepping up? And I'll give you an example. He got a truckload of a native brand of cigarettes driven by a native driver, and he is a native wholesaler going from Seneca Nation territory to a Mohawk territory. His driver was pulled over. They seized all the product, and then they not only confiscated the product, they didn't assess him the tax. They actually assessed a penalty, a fine, and at this point he's facing like a $1.3 million fine for. I mean, and it's not like this was a 50-foot trailer, of tobacco. I mean, it was quite a bit of tobacco, but this is what he's battling, and of course, when they first went after him, they went after the driver, they went after his a couple of the companies, or his other company that isn't even really the wholesale company, and I actually testified in the hearing. For the driver. And this was just a young kid. And he was being assessed this $1.3 million fine as well. So Sean John was on trial, essentially, for this fine. And I testified essentially as an expert witness, originally only to talk about, the reason I was brought in was because they were trying to dispute whether Gunyonge qualified as a native territory. And, of course, they get hung up on words like reservations. But the state lawyers and the judge allowed me a tremendous amount of leeway. We covered everything, that goes all the way back to, getting started in the tobacco business. We obviously talked about Gunyonge's history, but one of the things that I was also personally involved with was asking the question of New York State, what was their native to native trade policy? And in fact, I couldn't get an answer. So I went to Albany and I met with two state senators, a Republican and a Democrat, George Maziarz and Tim Kennedy. Maziarz is now retired. He was a Republican. Tim Kennedy was an up and comer for the Democrats. And I met with them and I talked about this. And I says, we can't get an answer. we can't get an answer from, and the guy's name was Tom Maddox, who was the commissioner for New York State Department of Taxation and Finance. We couldn't get an answer out of him. And we just, what's your policy? And we wanted to know specifically, what was your policy on native-to-native trade and native brands? So I worked with Kennedy's office and Maziar's office, and we drafted a letter, sent it to the I sent it to those guys, and they refined it. They went a little farther than I did. They took the position that they fully supported native to native trade, and that it was a positive impact on the areas that they represented, and they wanted the state to put in writing what their native to native trade policy was, and they to this day they still have never done it. Maziar's actually inquired 6 months later, a year later, another year later, and they were continuously rebuffed. And in fact, at some point, the attorney for the New York State Department of Taxation and Finance said, "Well, it's a gray area." Wait a second. What do you mean it's a gray area? Because funny thing is, when Eric's load got seized, they didn't say it was a gray area. They said he was clearly violating state law. Well, how is it a clear violation of state law if you won't even say what your policy is on this stuff? So that's what I testified and went through a lot of that history, and frankly, they cleared Sean. They cleared, and like I said, Sean was only about in his early 20s when this thing happened. He had this $1.3 million fine hanging over his head, and they cleared him. Now the problem is, they still won't clear Eric. So no matter what, the case was that we made for Sean, for some reason they're still trying to squeeze Eric because obviously he may be the principal, but it's still the same. It's still the same case. So the question that I have is nobody going to step up with Eric on this thing? This isn't just. I mean, this might be Eric's fine, but this impacts everything. All these folks. Ed, we talk a lot about. The potential that hemp could represent, not just the CBD stuff, but even hemp as a fiber product and that kind of stuff. But we don't represent a market on our territories big enough to support really much of any industry. We still are going to rely on some trade that goes off our territories, in native trade, to other territories, and non-native trade. So, but if we can't take a truck with a product that we produce and put it on the road without the fear of it being seized. I mean, let's face it, even if New York doesn't legalize marijuana, for instance, and some of the CBD products and the hemp products, if a grower here with a Seneca Nation license decides they want to supply something in Colorado or California or a state that has made it legal, if the state's going to go ahead and seize everything because they feel like they don't have to honor the fact that we are distinct people. Because that's what they ignored in the Maziar's and Kennedy letter. That's what Andrew Cuomo and Thomas Maddox ignored. They did not want to offer any distinction for Native people. And of course there's distinction. They know that there's a line that they cross when they come onto our territories. The state's position is that they have a right to tax us for sales that we make to non-Native people. And actually, I'll go beyond that. The position the state takes is that only a sale on Seneca territory to an enrolled Seneca is tax-free, as far as the state's concerned. So me, as a Mohawk living here, as far as the state's concerned, if I buy something, they have the right to tax it. And of course they don't. I mean, if somebody from Pennsylvania comes into Seneca territory and buys something, New York State says, well, we have a right to tax that. Why? They're not a New York State resident. They're not consuming the product in New York State. They're taking it from our native territory back to a state. Now, if Pennsylvania wants to tax them, that's one thing. But I can't wrap my head around why. I mean, whether this is a personality issue or what's going on. But I can't wrap my head around why it is that there aren't people beating a path to Eric's door to say, no, we're with you, man. We're with you on what you're doing here. And look, we all were very, very, we applauded the fact that John, the young guy, the young driver, beat the charge. But now, what, we think because Eric, is a successful business person that he can afford to pay the fine? The fine isn't the issue. It's the precedent that gets established. I don't know if you have a thought on this, but I mean, this is kind of where I want to have this conversation.
Yeah, the important thing to understand is taxation is not based upon who buys it. It's based upon where it's purchased. And that's one of the things people have to understand is that our territory is not part of New York State. None of our territories are part of New York State. And that therefore they have no authority to tax on our territory.
Well, and of course, most states, including New York State, they recognize that if Pennsylvania or let's say Ohio was going to send something to Vermont and it passes through New York State, they don't impose a tax because it's just passing through New York State. I mean, they recognize that there's interstate trade that happens, right? And so, so they recognize that. So they know unless we're introducing a product into the New York State commerce stream into their market. Look, and I'm not talking about people who come to our territories. That's still our market, and of course, here's the other thing that people seem to forget. Under New York State law, everybody who lives in New York State, and I'm not talking about our territories, who lives in New York State, everybody who lives in New York State can bring up to 2 cartons of cigarettes unstamped into New York State for their own use and consumption. Every single person in New York State could do that. Well, if you're old enough to buy cigarettes, I guess. So every consumer, that has nothing to do with us. That's somebody who can go down to Virginia and buy two cartons of cigarettes, or somebody who can go into Canada and buy 2 cartons of cigarettes. But as it applies to us, the New York State ignores that. In fact, when I talk about how they feel they have a right to tax every sale we make to a non-Seneca on Seneca land or a non-Mohawk on Mohawk land, they're ignoring the fact that the state already allows, even in New York City where they have an additional tax, a city tax on top of the state tax, a New York City resident can go into New Jersey, they can go into Pennsylvania, they can go farther down south where cigarettes are to a very low tax state, buy product and bring it into New York City, and it's legal. There's, in fact, what the language is that there's no tax liability for a consumer who brings in 2 cartons or less into New York State. So they completely ignore that when it relates to our sales. But that's not really what's at play here. What's at play here is Eric is a Seneca licensed wholesaler. He's a wholesaler licensed by the Seneca Nation to trade tobacco products. He only carries native products, so it is clearly a native to native trade issue with native brands. Now, if anybody in the Seneca Nation is saying, "Well, yeah, but we've never really licensed you to trade with other native territories," what do you mean? You don't prohibit that. And if you think that Eric violated his Seneca Nation wholesale license, then why didn't you take action? Why haven't you pulled his license? Because you know that you haven't. That's exactly the issue. So I mean, so when I think about what Eric is going through, and again, I think we put up a great defense for Sean. I didn't re-testify when Eric's case came before judges because they just submitted my testimony, but I don't know if it had the same impact. Honestly, I think being able to speak, and that judge actually asked me questions, and but Eric's got to appeal this thing, right? As it stands right now, the state is saying that not only does he owe $1.3 million in a fine for transporting a native brand of cigarettes from Seneca territory to Mohawk territory, but what they're saying is they can pull over any truck out off of our territory, any truck. All right. If you're listening to us streaming on our audio here, we're going to take a bit of a break right now because we're trying to catch our internet back up here. We seem to have lost our Facebook live stream, so we'll try to get that back. All right, folks, we're back. Apologize for that. We had a rainstorm just come through here and it took out our internet. Again, we don't have. What am I looking at? We don't have high speed internet here, so we rely on satellite. We don't have any fiber optic cables running through here. So let me try to pick it back up again. We'll patch this thing together and when we post it up later on. But Again, we're talking about Eric Wright's case, and the case that he is battling with New York State has to do with the state insisting that they have the authority to stop native to native trade. Now, they won't even address it as native to native trade. They're just saying, if you're in New York State and you don't have a stamp on your cigarettes, then we're seizing it. Now, of course, this violates not only the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples that talks specifically about us having the right to do commerce and forbids and essentially calls out any nation state or subdivision of that state from violating just basic human rights and specifically in the rights of indigenous peoples. But this goes well beyond all that. Look, New York State has been fighting us on tobacco and fuel and a whole bunch of other things for many, many years. There's a old case called the Atia case where when the state was first trying to impose their tax and their tax stamps upon us, a New York State wholesaler who they fought the state's attempt to do that, and the way they fought it was they went and applied and received a federal Indian trader's license from the Interior Department, and they made the case that their federal Indian trader's license superseded state law. Their ability to trade with Native people was not bound by state law. I think they lost in court, and then they won in court, and went all the way up to the Supreme Court. And the Supreme Court basically ruled against that, and they made a facial challenge about whether an Indian trader's license superseded state law, and they ruled against Atia, and they did so based on a couple of territories out west where the territories are kind of checkerboarded, and they had a couple of cases where the courts upheld the right for the states, not New York State, mind you, to impose a minimum burden for tax collection on the tribes in these places. Now, they aren't us. They were, native territories in completely different circumstances. Their lands were held in trust by the federal government. They were not lands that they held original title to like we do on our territories. None of that stuff. So it was a different situation. But in the Atia case, it's worth noting that in the opinion written on that case, the Supreme Court justice, I don't remember which one wrote this opinion, but what he said was the idea of taxing a product that we merely brought onto our territories from the non-native commerce stream to sell to non-native people for tax avoidance was, that stood on markedly different ground, and that's the word they use, than a product that we add value to, that we manufacture ourselves, that we have a role in not only bringing to market, but bringing into existence. So, what the opinion clearly established was there was a distinction between us dealing in native to native products, dealing with native brands, and that was that's why I reached out and worked with Senator Kennedy and Senator Maziarz to ask the question, because there is a valid question that needs to be asked about because and that Atia case, by the way, is New York State in federal court against the Atia brothers. I mean, this is a state taxation and finance. This is their case. So even in their case, and of course what people have said over the years was, well, that Atia case was a landmark decision that allowed the states to tax the Native people. No, it didn't. The only thing that was ruled in that case was whether a federal Indian trader's license superseded state law, and the court said it didn't. They made a point that they weren't talking about treaty issues, that we weren't a party to the case. The Native people weren't on trial there. It was a non-native wholesaler with a New York State wholesaling license, tobacco license, that was in this trial, not us. So the court made it clear that they weren't dealing with Seneca issues. They weren't dealing with with treaty issues. They weren't dealing with sovereignty issues. They were just dealing with a facial challenge and making a determination as to whether a federal Indian trader's license superseded state law. That was what the ATIA ruling was. But in that ruling, they went a little beyond the facial challenge, and they made an explicit distinction between a native product and a non-native product, a product that we, again, they didn't even say we had to manufacture. They just said a product we added value to. So even if we had it manufactured for us, if it was our brand, if it was a brand that we own, that we exclusively marketed, if it was a product that we added value to it in terms of, not just advertising, marketing and advertising, but added value to it because of packaging even. But the fact is, what Eric White was transporting from Seneca territory to Mohawk territory was a specific native brand that only native people were distributing, and it wasn't even for sale in New York State. No New York State retailers, no convenience stores, 7-Elevens or anybody else are dealing with these native brands. And in fact, they couldn't. They can't even buy these brands because of things like the Tobacco Settlement Act. So what Eric was dealing with, and he's not the only wholesaler, by the way. What he was dealing with was a native product manufactured by native. And even the tobacco, much of the tobacco was grown on native territory. I mean, it's not all of it, but that's how much value was added this from a native standpoint. So this was clearly native to native trade. And New York State won't even acknowledge it. And they would still never answer the question. To this day, Maziarz and Kennedy never got an answer to that. And they had subsequent letters sent off to the tax department as well. So this isn't just an Eric White issue. When I was dealing with these senators, was long before Eric White had this battle. And I was dealing with it because I felt like this is something, this was on the heels of New York State no longer allowing its New York State tobacco wholesalers to even sell its product without a stamp on it. So we were already positioning ourselves to deal with native brands, but it still remained this question mark because we didn't know what the state was going to do. After I worked with Maziarz and Kennedy to do that letter, the State Department of Taxation and Finance had an interdepartment memo that I actually got from the New York Post, by the way, that it was called the Do Not Seize memo. This memo laid out specifically what New York State taxing authorities, and right down to the state police or local authorities, what the tax department was recommending that they seize and what they didn't seize. What they're saying is if you see a cart of a truckload of Marlboros, seize it. But they made it very clear: if it's a native brand, do not seize. That's the Do Not Seize memo. And you know what? Eric and others made sure that the Maziarz and Kennedy letter was on the truck, and the Do Not Seize letter was on truck. They had a full bill of lading for everything that they had. So this isn't smuggling. This is just native to native trade that New York State refuses to acknowledge. Now, the reason I think this is such an important issue is because it's going to affect everything else. Every type of commerce that we want to carve out that is ours, that is distinctly ours, that operates under a native license or that we do. I mean, again, hemp comes to mind, but not just hemp. Anything that we do that doesn't have us totally complicit or compliant, I guess, with state regs makes us vulnerable to the state. And for those people who say, well, that's why we need to have stamps on our product. Well, they don't recognize that. I mean, that's as silly as those people who claim that they're dual citizens. Oh, I'm a Seneca citizen and I'm an American citizen. Well, they'd be fine, except for the United States doesn't recognize that Seneca citizenship, and that is what's apparent in this situation, because they aren't recognizing us as distinct at all. I mean, they used to say once you step off your territory, you're just another white man. Essentially, is what they said. But they have actually tried to encroach even farther onto our territories. And like I said earlier, they believe that that they have the right to tax us for anything that we sell to a non-native, or if you're in Seneca territory, to a non-Seneca. I mean, that's how crazy the state's thinking is on this thing. And, of course, it's not supported by any law. They have nothing that gives them that kind of support. Just their general New York State laws as it applies to, the regulation of tobacco. But they won't make any – there's no distinction that the state is willing to make about our territories and about our right to do native-to-native trade, even if it is completely exclusive of the native or the New York State commerce stream. And again, part of the thing that I can't get past, Ed, is that their commerce flows through our territory. They have rail that flows through. And their commerce flows through our territory completely unfettered access to our territory. The New York State Thruway, Interstate 86, Route 20, Route 5, Route 438, all of these highways that go through our territory that we allowed them to put through our lands, they run their commerce through. We don't get any reports. There's certainly no revenue, but that crosses through our territory completely. And you know what? That's not a terrible thing if they gave us the same respect, but they don't.
They also have the power lines as well as the gas lines.
Yep, power lines.
And
they do not have high-speed internet going through our territories.
No, they don't. But take a look at it. If you're getting electric from the power lines, you pay tax. So it's really important. If they're going to charge tax for us going through their territory, then the Seneca Nation ought to consider whether or not they should pay tax to the Seneca Nation for going through our territory.
Well, and that'd be fine, but at this point, we can't even get the Seneca Nation to bat an eyelash on this.
Right. We're going to have to. That's where you said precedent has to be realized and taken a look at. Why? Because it's going to affect our people, and it's going to affect not just us, it's going to affect our future generations.
And if you don't think it matters, look, we're going to take a break. We're kind of at the bottom of the hour. I know our timing is a little off here because of losing the internet earlier, but we're going to take a break. When we come back, I want to talk about that case we discussed earlier in Washington State, where a Yakima fuel wholesaler was fined and charged by the state of Washington, and that wholesaler's the company name was Cougar Den, and they fought the state of Washington, and the Yakima Nation stepped up and they submitted what I thought was a pretty powerful brief in the case against Cougar Den, and they won. It went all the way to the Supreme Court. And they won. So anybody who thinks that, well, just leave it on Eric's shoulders and we'll let him sink or swim. Look, there's just too much at stake for that. So we'll talk about that when we come back. I'll talk more about the Yakima case when we come back. This is John Kane with Ed Schindler, and this is Let's Talk Native.
Riches under the ground. Forget the treaties when money's round. Dig up the bones and rape the land. just as long as we can stand. We will not be idle anymore. We will not be idle anymore. No. The time has come to make things right. We won't go away, not without a fight. Some people say it's time to let it go, but this is our land. We won't be idle anymore.
All right, thanks for coming back. This is John Kane. I've got Ed Schindler in studio. I want to thank our sponsors. Let's Talk Native is sponsored by Ross and Holly John and the RJE family of businesses, Eric White and ERW Enterprises, and his tobacco wholesaler as well. And if, I've got another sponsor that chooses to remain nameless, so we'll keep it at that. Could always use more. For those of you who used to, on occasion, drop a check in the mail, my mailbox still works, so don't be afraid to drop one in there. Look, I am grateful for the consistent support that I get from from our main sponsors. And to those of you who contribute when you can. I'm also very grateful to those who watch us, who comment, who share the video, share the audio, and including my wife, who shares our Facebook live stream on so many group pages. I also want to thank those of you who allow us to share our video on your group pages. So it's a way that we promote this conversation. All right, before the break, look, there is some precedent here, and good precedent. When I think about what transpired, it was only a little over a month ago that that Cougar Den, a fuel wholesaler in Yakima, a fuel wholesaler in the state of Washington, had to fight the state, and it went all the way to the Supreme Court. But they didn't fight it on their own. They did have support. Their nation, the Yakima Nation, submitted a very powerful brief, a brief that was broken up into two pieces. One, and this was really exceptional, laid out how wrong it is that so much of this oppression and this control that states tried to assert over us finds its origins in the doctrine of discovery. Nobody's even done that. I mean, so the fact that they did it, I applauded it immensely. Now, so the first part of the brief was really laying out the false narrative on both the state and the federal government for claiming its superiority over our peoples, right? And that's just basic, racist, religious, superiority that the United States has claimed, based on, a religious doctrine that said the Christian nations of Europe had the power to just take land and conquer people even without conquest. I mean, it's that simple. Now, the other part of their brief talked about specific language in treaties. And you know what? We have a specific language, too. I mean, again, you'll only have to look at language in like the Canandaigua Treaty, and there's others that talk about the United States recognizing that our land is ours and that we will not be disturbed in the free use and enjoyment of our lands. Now, the other thing is, I get troubled when people say, well, we have treaty rights. Look, we don't have treaty rights. Rights aren't granted to us in treaties. Rights, there may be rights that are recognized in treaties, but you know what? It isn't just about what is in the treaties, that we can say we have rights to. If they haven't had any legal authority to take a right away, I mean, where is their foundation for saying that we don't have the right to do tobacco, for instance, or do any kind of native-to-native trade? There is nothing. That was never surrendered. I mean, we're coming up on the July 4th here. We're gonna have a conversation about in New York on my show about the Declaration of Independence, and one of the things that they tried to say is that governments are instituted among men, depriving their just powers from the consent of the governed. Well, if we didn't consent to this stuff, how can they say that they have the just powers to assert this thing? This isn't just about whether we could envision 100 years ago, 200 years ago, what rights we had to secure in treaties. I mean, that's bullshit. Look, they have to be able to say, no, here's the line in the sand where you on this day, from this day forward, had to follow state law. Doesn't exist. At least not one that we consented to. Now, they can pass laws. I mean, look, in 1924, they passed a law. They said that we were U.S. citizens. But you know what? It didn't mean that we were U.S. citizens. It means that they said it. It didn't mean that we said it. So, when they say that, when the federal government passes a law that says, okay, we're going to grant states jurisdiction over this or that, or civil or criminal jurisdiction, if we didn't concede to that, then you have no consent of the governed. We don't consider ourselves to be governed by New York State. We don't consider ourselves to be governed by the federal government. I mean, the Seneca Nation position is really clear here, that this land is not part of the United States. It's not part of New York State. And we have never surrendered our right to do commerce from one native territory to another, whether it's with the Yakima, or whether it's with the Mohawks, whether it's with the Shinnecock, or whether it's with the Porch Creek. No matter who it is, we have never surrendered our right to do native to native commerce. And clearly the United States recognizes. That's why they even have that the BS Federal Indian Traders License. They know that there's a distinction. And in fact, the Commerce Clause of the U.S. Constitution says that the Congress shall have the authority to regulate commerce in and among several states, with foreign nations, and with Indian tribes. But they don't mean between. They don't mean the commerce of native people, of Indians. They mean the commerce between their citizenry and us. There's nothing in state law, in the Constitution of the United States that grants that kind of power. And I think that's what people have to recognize.
I think people have to recognize that commerce between Indian nations existed long before the Native Americans met the Europeans. There was hemp being traded. We've got songs and we've got materials that came from as far as Florida, as far as the Dakotas.
Oh, tobacco, tools, all kinds of stuff, yeah.
And
corn.
The commerce existed way before the Europeans even arrived. So it's not as if they're granting us anything. They don't have anything to grant us. We already have our rights and our commerce and our communications. All of those existed
We
before.
have historic trade routes that have existed long before a non-native person, before Europeans ever came to our territories. And the point, and to your point, is there is nothing that suggests we ever surrendered that to Canada, to the United States, or to anybody else.
No, we didn't surrender any of that, nor did we surrender the right to address it.
Well, and I think that when I think about what took place with the Yakima, and look, it was a Trump appointee, Neil Gorsuch, who cast a swing vote and actually gave a pretty strong opinion on the Yakima case, on the Cougar Den case. So, I mean, look, we are not without means for making a solid argument that even holds up in a Trump Supreme Court. And I'm not suggesting that that's where we need to fight this thing. I mean, look, I hear all these conversations continuously about restorative justice. There's no restorative justice when the state of New York will try to fine a 20-year-old kid $1.3 million for driving a truck for a native company. And then when they get rid of that charge against him, still try to keep it against the individual who's the principal of the company. I mean, look, if the Yakima Nation could step up and support Cougar Den, then the Seneca Nation should step up and support Eric White in this case. And you know what? It isn't just the Seneca Nation. There are retailers that are out there that Eric has serviced over these years. They should step up. Look, there's financial costs associated with these kind of legal fights, but there's also briefs that could be filed. And let the folks up in Akwesasne submit a brief. Let the folks in all these other nations submit briefs to say, to defend our right to native trade. And we've got to be strong about this thing. And you know what? Do what the Yakima did. Cite the doctrine of discovery. Cite the false narrative that the states and the United States try to claim as the foundation for their authority. Because it is. It is false. It is racist. Scientifically false. Legally invalid. Again, you can look to my Ruth Bader Ginsburg video. Legally invalid. That is what is the basis for even this. Every jurisdictional case, the doctrine of discovery isn't just about land claims. It's not just about land title. It is about the United States and the individual states asserting that somehow we have been conquered by them. I mean, if you go back to Johnson v. McIntosh, Justice Marshall literally said that discovery of an inhabited country, of an inhabited land, was the same as conquering those people. I mean, that's what the justice said, and that's not true. That's not. I mean, he called it he said, however extravagant the pretension of making that statement is, that's not an extravagant pretension. It's a lie. It's not just absurd. It's a lie. You can't equate somebody, just happening upon a group of people with saying, okay, now I've conquered you. I mean, that's literally what the United States Supreme Court ruled in Johnson v. McIntosh, and that's the foundation for everything that every individual state, whether it's Washington State or New York State, and what the federal government's doing to our people. I don't know. I mean, this is what I find so frustrating, and look, here's the risk when people just sit back and let one individual fight this, because look, if Eric loses this thing, how many people are going to say, well, you did it wrong? Well, then help. Then help him do it right. Let the Seneca Nation step up. If you've got a thought on how we need to push back on the state, don't just sit there and this goes back to the stirring the ashes thing, right?
Yes.
We talked about in the last show. If you know what the issue is and you sit back and remain quiet, and then when the issue doesn't turn out well, say, well, I never agreed with the way that he was doing. Then where the hell was your voice when it mattered? And Seneca Nation, if you're going to sit there and say that Eric didn't have the right to conduct commerce with another native territory, then you better do it, because you better make it very clear, because Rob Porter tried to do that once. Rob Porter tried to, and I'll tell you, he really pissed off a lot of people. He tried to say that Seneca wholesalers couldn't trade with non-federally recognized tribes. And I'll tell you, you know what? You know how the folks down in Long Island responded? They said, oh, so is Rob Porter just calling us a bunch of half-breeds and niggers? That's literally what came out of Harry Wallace's mouth, because he was pissed. Because since when should we allow the federal government to determine for us who is a legitimate native person or not? I mean, and I'll tell you, so anybody will make the claim that somehow Eric shouldn't have been conducting commerce off territory. Everybody knows that's what wholesalers have been doing. I mean, look, there's manufacturers, guys like Gary Sandin, Heron cigarettes. I mean, there's some that are produced right here in Seneca territory. Are you going to suggest that the state can tell you you can only sell that product in Seneca territory? That you can't conduct commerce from one native territory to another? How do we develop a brand and branding and develop our own brands if we can't market it to other native territories? And again, I got to go back to the hemp issue. We can't put in, acres, of hemp for fiber, or build greenhouses for controlled growth of hemp for CBD oils or anything else, and only market it here. If we're going to use a Seneca Nation license, something that's going to be distinct from New York State, then if we try to enter any kind of state commerce stream or even the commerce stream of another native territory, this precedent that the state is establishing in this Eric White case will kill hemp, kill CBD, it'll kill legalized marijuana, it'll kill everything that we try to do that represents any kind of distinction for our commerce here on our native territory that expects to do any kind of commerce native to native or crossing a state line to another native territory. That's what's at stake here. And I got to tell you, any of you who don't recognize that are then you're just putting blinders on, or maybe you're trying to justify maybe some animosity you have towards Eric. I mean, and I've seen this play out over years. It's so easy to demonize the individual instead of seeing that there's a bigger issue at play here. This stuff matters, and I'll tell you, one of the other points I wanted to talk about more generally, Ed, was we can't turn this into a competition over who is doing it right and who is doing it wrong, or who is more Indianer than the other. Every time I hear somebody say, "Well, if you shouldn't be paying a toll then if you're so sovereign." Look, we all have to do what we have to do to survive here, and I agree that we oftentimes compromise in places that we don't need to, and that's what I talk about here on the show. I try to say, look, we don't need to enlist in the armed forces. There's no necessity for us to do that. To me, that's a compromise. And there are things that we don't need to do. And we should find solutions within our territory so we don't use the outside. That's that whole decolonization mantra that I try to talk about. But not everybody can avoid paying a state tax. Not everybody can avoid paying a federal tax. Some places you can more easily than others. And in every place that we can avoid paying state or federal taxes, we should avoid paying state and federal taxes. Some people are going to be able to draw a much firmer line in the sand and say, hell no, I will not pay any federal income tax. Well, then let's stand with each other and let's help that person make that case. Because once we can establish that precedent, then none of us pay federal income tax. As it is, none of us pay state income tax if we live here on native territories. I mean, so clearly the state recognizes that, and yet we get into this whole battle that they're going to ignore that there's any distinction when it comes to native to native trade. But we can't keep throwing each other under a bus. Look, my hat goes off to somebody like Will Perry, who drives through the tolls and say, "No, I'm not paying your toll." And sends a letter saying that he's not going to pay tolls. I applaud him. Is everybody going to do that? No. Look, I cringe at the notion that people go out and get a U.S. passport to make it easier to travel into Canada and back. We shouldn't do that. But you know what? Where the hell is the Seneca Nation or any of these other nations in terms of fighting for our right to create our own travel documents? And I'm not talking about the enhanced tribal card either. That's not our travel document. That's one of theirs. I mean, this is the stuff where we need to, as a people, and as those who are supposed to represent us, whether they're nation officials or whether they're representatives, but look, we've got to do more. We've got to do more. And when somebody is in the throes of a battle like this, like Eric White, the Seneca Nation needs to step up.
Yeah. And I think it's really got to be important for people to understand that it's not who makes a purchase, it's where they make the purchase. So it doesn't matter whether they're Seneca or not. They don't have to pay taxes on Seneca territory unless the Seneca Nation passes that part of the Constitution.
They have a tax code. But one of the things, and this is even when we battle the state over this revenue sharing stuff. Look, almost no native territories have adopted fully the tax scenario that states and federal government and the federal government have adopted. We don't. That it's actually for many people find that to be too far away from their culture. The idea of, in fact, even the United States had to kind of change and alter laws to do the kind. It used to be against the Constitution to have a tax unless it was apportioned properly. I mean, sales tax, income tax wasn't something that was legal in the United States. They didn't pass that until 1913. And even when they passed that, if you read the statute, it makes it sound like it's voluntary. Voluntary my ass. I mean, they lock people up for what they do? They don't actually lock you up, by the way, for not paying taxes. They lock you up for committing fraud in how you report that stuff, which is, that's kind of how they get you on this stuff. But we do not have to submit to their regulatory systems that are out there. Whatever we develop on our own territories is one thing, and the Seneca Nation and any of these nations really need to be careful, because if all we do is mirror what they've done on the outside, then it really weakens our argument about how much we condemn that system of governance or regulatory authority. Mm-hmm. I've talked when I've talked about the word sovereignty before. I have a tendency now to move away from that word, because sovereignty is about power. It's not about freedom. I mean, when you say you're sovereign, that means that you have power. You have power over things that are against our culture, like a power over land, power over other people. I mean, that's what a sovereign is. A sovereign is it has to do with having the reign or the power or authority over something. Not, I mean, our word, tewatatawi, which means I carry myself, or we carry ourselves. That's what we're saying. We have, by the power of creation, we have the right to carry ourselves. We don't have the right to dictate to other people, about how much power we have. That's what sovereigns do. That's why that word, we've appropriated that word over the years, but I'm troubled by it at some level, and I would rather fight for a free and independent existence than saying that we are somehow an equal sovereign with the state, because the authorities that the states wield are not derived from the consent of the governed. Again, I'm going to do this breakdown of the Declaration of Independence in New York on my show on Thursday. I'm doing a special 2-hour broadcast on WBAI Thursday from 4 to 6. And I'm going to go through this thing. I mean, clearly, from a native standpoint, the first thing that jumps out at us with the Declaration of Independence is the reference to us as merciless Indian savages. But there's plenty of hypocrisy. And, in this era now of, Trump calling everything fake news and lying on a daily basis, we always talk about fact checking. But has anybody ever fact checked the Declaration of Independence? Some of the stuff that Jefferson claims in this thing, and he's the one who authored this thing, I mean, you couldn't be more hypocritical. The easy stuff is like, all men are created equal and bestowed with inherent rights by their creator. Yeah, that's what Jefferson says, as he has not only slaves but sex slaves. I mean, this is a man who kept slaves and kept one for his personal concubine, writing words that all men are created equal. I mean, the hypocrisy is incredible. And so, but when I get to that line, consent of the governed, that's where this stuff all comes up. Because when you got the state of New York or the federal government or anybody else trying to impose their will upon us, when we've never given it to them, there's never been a transfer. Again, I'll use the word. We've never transferred our sovereignty to them. We've never submitted or surrendered ourselves. I mean, we hear people post it all the time. Oh, that's, you were conquered. No, we weren't. We weren't conquered. Senecas weren't conquered by the United States. Mohawks weren't conquered by the United States or New York State. In fact, most of these nations, I mean, the amount of armed conflicts that took place between the United States and Native people were less than 50 conflicts, 50 armed conflicts. Now, there was plenty of murder that took place, massacres, but in terms of conquest, and again, I go back to Justice John Marshall trying to equate discovery of an inhabited country with conquering that same people in that same country. It's absurd. It's ridiculous. And so unless we have somehow given ourselves, submitted, allowed ourselves to be subjugated, to be subjects of the United States, they've got no documentation that suggests that ever occurred. They can't put a line in the sand. They can't say, well, on this date this happened. They can't say this treaty, this surrender, this agreement. There's nothing like that. Look, they've passed laws that were unilateral on their side, but Never is there any place where they can say there's consent. And again, I know that the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People is kind of a weak and a non-binding agreement, but what's laced through that entire agreement is this whole idea of free, prior, and informed consent. Not just consultation, not just notifying us that, oh yeah, by the way, we're not going to let you do this anymore. No, the idea that we have consented to some change in our relationship, or consented to to granting authority to them over us. Never happened. Never happened. Look, I know our timing got a little screwed up here today because of losing internet. We had a storm roll through. So we're going to wrap this thing up. I don't know if by the time we edit some of this stuff down, hopefully we come up with a full hour. This is one of those cases, and I say it often, the best viewing of this show may be on YouTube or audio catching us on a podcast. Sorry for the disruption with our internet and the weather, but look, catch my show. It's a special broadcast on July 4th. Yes, I am talking about the Declaration of Independence, and it is a special 2-hour broadcast, so I will be taking calls in New York City for a full hour, in that hour from 5 to 6. So I look forward to that, doing that show down there, and I look forward to the interaction with listeners. But look, those of you who listen to this show and are from back home here, you can call into New York City too, and so we will stream that show on Facebook Live, and of course, if you go to WBAI.org, www.wbai.org, you can stream live audio of that show as well. Look, this is John Kane with That Schindler. I want to thank you for listening. We'll see you back here on Saturday.
Yeah.